Thank you very much, David, for this opportunity and for your continued support for Georgia. There is a great occasions happening on the geopolitical map, but let's begin with Iran, where airstrikes have resumed, the already fragile ceasefire has collapsed, and the deployment of U.S. military forces is once again increasing. Few people truly believe that the truce would last, but what do you expect this new phase to look like? The previous agreement did not appear particularly favorable for the United States. What consequences could this renewed escalation have for both America and the wider world?
The situation in the Middle East, it remains very complicated, and it is reflecting the fact that the Iranian regime, despite having lost a number of its leaders, more or less is the same. It is the same ideologically. It is the same in terms of cracking down on its population. It's the same in terms of trying to control the Strait of Hormuz. And in some respects, it may be even more emboldened because of the loss of those other leaders. There likely is a sense of revenge that they feel that they need to pursue. And so the memorandum of understanding that was reached a few weeks ago was interpreted differently by both the US side and the Iranian side. And I think the lack of clarity in it and the different interpretations of it leave us to where we are now, which is a resumption in hostilities, attacks. There was even a missile launched apparently toward Jordan. And I expect that the United States and now possibly Israel too will respond with more force. I don't think either side wants to see a blow up of violence, of attacks. But it seems that right now, both sides are posturing. The President Trump goes back and forth between criticizing the Iranian regime, saying that they're making progress. It's a little hard to read where things are right now, let alone where they might be going over the next days and weeks.
Do you still believe the situation could eventually lead to a ground operation, despite the fact that President Trump, who describes himself as a president of peace, clearly does not want such an outcome? During the NATO summit, President Trump appeared visibly frustrated, calling Iran's leaders scammers and sick people. Judging by this tone and attitude, do you believe there is a real possibility of a ground offensive?
I think a ground operation is unlikely. As you and your viewers know, the United States will hold what are called midterm elections, which is for every House seat, along with 1/3 of the Senate seats. And that is in November. The military operation, the war so far has been quite unpopular in the United States. And sending ground troops into Iran, I think, would be even more unpopular. The president campaigned on ending forever wars. That would create the impression that we are stuck in another war in the Middle East. And so I think it's unlikely that we would see ground troops going in.
If Iran refuses to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, what happens next? In your view, what should the United States response be? And to conclude this topic, I'd like to ask about the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. At the beginning of the war, they appeared to be acting in full coordination. At this stage, do you believe Israeli and American strategic interests still fully coincide?
I think we have seen, a split between the U.S. and Israel in certain respects. And we have seen some criticism come from President Trump himself toward Prime Minister Netanyahu. We have seen, I think, Israeli objectives with Hezbollah and Lebanon be very different. But I think Israel and the United States still have to maintain very close relations and have to try to work together on this. Israel, I think, does have different objectives. They worry that the United States will end the conflict with Iran prematurely and not deal with the real threat, which is the continuation of the regime in Tehran. The United States, on the other hand, I think, having failed to totally remove the regime, despite taking out the Ayatollah and a number of other key leaders, the regime is still largely in place. And I think the Trump administration has had to adjust its strategy and objectives there. Israel, of course, still faces a threat from Hezbollah. Iran has used that to try to create problems and divisions between Israel and the United States. So there, too, the whole situation remains quite complicated.
Let's move on the NATO summit in Ankara and decision to grant Ukraine a license to produce Patriot air defense systems. This would have been almost unimaginable in 2022 or even last year. In your view, how credible and sustainable is this decision? We all remember the earlier discussion surrounding Tomahawk missiles and the tense meeting between President Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office. What has fundamentally changed? Has the so-called spirit of anchorage disappeared? Does President Trump now believe that Ukraine is stronger and, as he often tends to do, prefers to stand with the stronger side?
What clearly has changed is that the Ukrainians have seized the momentum. That's not to say that Russia is defeated, not by a long shot. The Russians have been inflicting tremendous damage and death on Ukraine in the past week alone with ballistic and cruise missiles. Ukrainians are able to deal with Russian drones, but it's the ballistic missiles that pose the challenge, and the Ukrainians are in desperate need of interceptors to deal with that, such as Patriots. And that's where yesterday's meeting between Trump and Zelensky may have been quite important if the United States does, in fact, allow Ukraine to join production of Patriot missiles, to license the production by the Ukrainians. The problem with that is that will take quite a while to see those Patriot missiles produced. The Ukrainians are in desperate need now of Patriot missiles. And I hope coming out of the NATO summit that we will see some European allies turn over their interceptors, their Patriot missiles, with the promise that the United States would replace those supplies. The Ukrainians really need interceptors to deal with the Russian ballistic missiles. But you're also very right that I think President Trump and his administration sense that there has been a shift, a change. And I think they have been deeply impressed by Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russian territory, hitting in particular energy facilities and refineries, creating an energy crisis inside Russia to the point where it has to import gasoline now, which is quite ironic. And I think, as the president said yesterday, this may be a necessary escalation in order to move toward an end to the war, escalate to de-escalate, so to speak. And so there has been a notable change in the way the war has unfolded. And the question will remain whether the United States will follow up on what President Trump seemed to indicate yesterday.
President Trump arrived in Turkey visibly frustrated with several allies. There was an uncomfortable exchange with Giorgia Meloni, followed by tensions with Spain. Yet in the end, the summit projected an image of Euro-Atlantic unity. In your opinion, how genuine and durable is that unity?
I think there was quite a contrast between the first day of the summit and the second day. The first day, the president had a lot of criticism that he voiced publicly. But on the second day, he indicated that there was a lot of love in the room, a lot of unity among the allies. He softened his criticism of Spain. Yes, you're right that he and Prime Minister Maloney seem to be having some issues, and that seems to have been a very unnecessary issue that that was created. But all in all, I think allies are relieved. They think it went better than they feared it might have. And the fact that allies are agreeing to contribute more of their GDP to defense spending is an issue where President Trump does deserve a fair bit of credit. He has pushed on this issue to end what he views as freeloading by allies. I don't think that's entirely accurate, but he has pressed the NATO allies to increase their defense spending. They are doing so. And I think that also created a more positive environment. The Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has spent a lot of time cultivating a relationship with President Trump. Some have criticized him, feeling that he has gone too far in that cultivation. But it may, at the end of the day, produce the results that NATO needs to see.
So he came with a very specific mission, right?
Correct, exactly.
Let's continue with the summit. President Trump himself said that one of the reasons he came to Ankara was President Erdogan. There seems to be a certain personal chemistry between them. In your assessment, has Turkey become a central player in US and European security policy, given the tensions with Iran and Europe's broader security challenges? Is the West becoming increasingly dependent on Erdogan's Turkey?
Well, Turkey obviously physically is a key player both in Europe and in the Middle East. Given its location, and President Erdogan and President Trump have established a strong relationship. President Trump has not raised concerns about the political and democratic situation inside Turkey, which President Erdogan, I think, appreciates. And President Trump, of course, indicated lifting the sanctions on Turkey and allowing the sale of F-35s to go forward. Turkey has hosted various meetings involving both Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East, and plays a key role. And I think President Trump recognizes that. And as you said, he went to the NATO summit, at least he indicated initially, because President Erdogan was hosting it.
Let's turn to Georgia. Georgia was not represented at the NATO summit in Ankara, despite the fact that neighboring Turkey has traditionally been one of the strongest supporters of Georgia's NATO integration. Georgia was also absent from Washington summit. This is becoming a deeply troubling trend. To what extent can we say that Bidzina Ivanishvili's isolationist policy have ultimately driven Georgia away from its Western partners?
I'm not sure I'd agree that Ivanishvili, Kobakhidze, and others are pursuing an isolationist policy. They seem to be pursuing a policy of cozying up to Moscow. And that, frankly, is even more disturbing in some respects. They were represented at, I think the president went for the funeral of the Ayatollah in Iran. There have been extensive contacts with the Iranians, with the Chinese, as well as with the Russians, of course. And so I think it is less isolationist and more a reflection that Georgian dream is moving in a direction that few other countries are doing. You see what's happened in Armenia, which is trying to move closer to the West. You see what's happening in other parts of that region. Even Belarus is, for all my criticism of the illegitimate president, Alexander Lukashenko, even he is trying to resist Russian pressure to enter the war. Georgia is not looking to enter the war. I don't mean to suggest that. But Georgia is certainly improving relations with Russia significantly at the same time that its relationship with the EU, with NATO, with the United States is deteriorating a lot. And that, I think, is very disturbing, particularly since the people of Georgia remain very pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-democracy. And you see this real split between the government of Georgia and the people of Georgia. And you still see thousands of people turn out in the streets every single night, which is pretty incredible.
Thank you for this position. Since you mentioned Mikhail Gavrilashvili's visits to Iran for the Ayatollah's funeral, and since you described this as a part of Bidzina Ivanishvili's deliberate foreign policy priorities, could this become another source of tension between the Georgian Dream government and the Trump administration? Or do you believe Washington simply does not consider Ivanishvili's government important enough to warrant that level of attention?
I think, unfortunately, it's the latter. I think the U.S. administration is preoccupied with many other issues and is not paying much attention to the situation in Georgia. I wish it would. We don't have an ambassador there now. We don't even have a nominee for a new ambassador to Georgia. And I think Russia, Ukraine is taking up a lot of time. Iran, of course, is taking up a lot of time. China takes up a lot of time. And the administration, as you know, from its national security strategy, is also focused on the Western Hemisphere, meaning Central America and South America, as well as Canada. And so Georgia, unfortunately, I would say, is falling through the cracks. And that means that the United States, at least in the executive branch, is not paying a lot of attention. In the legislative branch, in Congress, you do see a fair bit of attention. Congressman Joe Wilson, in particular, has been very outspoken and has, I think, done an excellent job in bringing attention to the situation. Roger Wicker, the senator from Mississippi, has also focused, Senator Shaheen and others. So there are members of Congress who are paying attention. But the executive branch, I hope, can find some ways of applying more pressure on Georgian Dream and on Ivanishvili.
Yes, Congressman Joe Wilson was very active during OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. You have probably seen the declaration on Georgia as well. One of the week's most significant developments was the resolution adopted by the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly at Congressman Joe Wilson's initiative. Also, representatives of the Georgian Dream Party tried to block or soften the resolution. They were unsuccessful. How significant is this decision, and what impact could it have if OSCE Moscow mechanism is activated?
I think any opportunities to bring more attention to the deteriorating situation in Georgia are welcome. And I salute Congressman Wilson for his determination to get this through. But at the end of the day, it requires either the EU as a whole or individual governments to impose sanctions. And I think sanctions are really what are key to addressing the declining situation in Georgia. We, the United States, have imposed sanctions, as you know, on Ivanishvili, but we have not done so on the rest of the government. We've done so on a few judges, but not on the government. The government clearly, in my view, should be sanctioned by the United States, but the EU should take similar measures. And there I'm at a loss to explain why these steps have not been taken, other than they are distracted with other issues. But I think the EU and the United States are underestimating their influence and ability to bring about change in Georgia, and could do more than what they have been.
Yes, we're certainly expecting an appropriate response from the West. You mentioned the sanctions imposed on Bidzina Ivanishvili, which remain in force. Does this suggest that his strategy of persuading the West to accept Georgia as it is today, becoming increasingly authoritarian, has ultimately failed, including with the Trump administration?
It's failed in terms of getting the sanctions lifted, but he is also getting away with the fact that pressure has not increased. And the U.S. Embassy is not speaking out about what's happening there. The State Department is not speaking out there. And the Megabari Act has not passed Congress. So, and now that former Senator Mark Wayne Mullen is now in the administration, you would think that the Senate could actually pass that legislation. So on the one hand, he has not been able to lift the sanctions against him, but we have not seen more pressure applied against the rest of Georgian Dream and the government.
Yes, and last week, Irakli Kobakhidze was invited to the U.S. Embassy Independence Day reception and was even given the opportunity to deliver remarks. How should we interpret that? Was it simply diplomatic protocol, or did it carry a broader political message?
I suppose I could understand that he would be invited. I think it was a mistake to have given him the microphone. I would hope that something like that wouldn't happen again.
I'd also like to ask about the Irakli deep support. It appears that Bidzina Ivanishvili is trying to establish a working relationship with the Trump administration. At the same time, however, there seems to be a strategic shift regarding the Irakli effort. Previously, there was considerable discussion about Chinese involvement, but now the government says the project will be completed by Georgia itself, with neither China nor Russia participating. What do you think this apparent change in policy signifies?
It's hard to say. I mean, the United States would be the best partner, or the Europeans would be a good partner. Having the Chinese involved would not be a good sign. It would deepen the Chinese role and involvement in Georgia. And it would be a further move away from the West. So if the Georgian Dream government thinks it can do it on its own, there are some who would say good luck, but it seems like it would need the investment and the expertise of outsiders to help develop it. And I hope that the right decision will be made that would serve the best interests of the Georgian people.
One final question before we conclude. Although the government appears to be preparing another wave of arrests targeting opposition leaders, former President Mikhail Saakashvili remains imprisoned. Opposition leader Elena Khoshtaria is behind the bars, along with numerous other activists, journalists, poets, singers, government critics. They continue to face imprisonment or illegal persecution. There are now growing expectations that additional opposition leaders could soon end up behind bars. In your view, what is Bidzina Ivanishvili trying to achieve through this strategy?
I think Ivanishvili and Kobakhidze and others are following the Kremlin playbook, where they go after the critics, the opponents, they go after civil society, they go after journalists. We have seen this play out in other authoritarian regimes, and that seems to be the direction that Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream seem to be taking Georgia, sadly. And so I think these kinds of actions are not surprising, and they will continue until the Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream pay a bigger price.
We hope that Washington and Brussels will devote greater attention to Georgia. Thank you once again for your insightful analysis and for your continued support for Georgia.
Of course. Good to see you again. I wish you the best.
Thank you. Goodbye.